it's on silent. Okay, so good morning again. It's my pleasure to introduce Ursula Huws, who will be giving us a lecture on platformisation and the commodification of reproductive labour. As most of you will have probably noticed by now, Ursula is immensely knowledgeable on issues of informal labour, social reproduction, the platformisation of labour, and given what you'll all be doing research in co-working spaces that are famed and conventionally known as spaces where people carry out informal labour, I'm sure you'll find her talk extremely interesting. Ursula Huws is an Emerita Professor at the University of Hertfordshire and the Director of Analytica Research Agency. And without further ado, I think I'll let her get on with it all. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Martha. First of all, let me say what a delight it is to be here and to meet so much exciting new scholarship and to be venturing out of the world of Zoom for almost the first time in about 5 years. No, it's really great to be here. But I would like to particularly thank the organising team and especially Anais for not only bringing me here, but kind of accommodating my multiple disabilities in such a charming and lovely way. So thank you very much. I had a bit of a problem actually working out where to start speaking today. I'll probably should begin by saying that I'm drawing on 3 recent publications, largely. The one on the left is a very theoretical book that came out in 2019, if I remember right. The one in the middle is extremely empirical, that came out in 2019 also. And the third one, which came out in 2020, and bombed in the UK completely, but is being translated into Portuguese at least. It's having a kind of afterlife. It was intended as a kind of political intervention, drawing on the results of this work, the reinventing the welfare state. I'm only mentioning it because it has some ideas for positive uses of platforms in local economic development contexts, which might be interesting for some of you. Where to start? I'm trying to find, whoops. Right, I think I'm going to start with some general remarks about local economies, which may seem a little bit obvious, but I think need to be restated. Firstly, local economies are very different from each other. And one way to think about this conceptually is that capitalism develops at different paces and in different ways in different locations. And there are very crudely 3 stages of capitalist development, which of course exist alongside each other, but exist to different degrees in different locations and shape what's going on locally. And the first stage is commodification, what Marx called primitive accumulation. It's like the first stage in which capitalism penetrates a local economy, and it might be through mining or some kind of extraction activity, or through attempting to impose a kind of more a commodified form of agriculture, or it might be through developing new commodities based on what have up to that point been local production activities. But it doesn't necessarily, in fact it never covers the whole economy, but it covers the economy to very, very different degrees in different locations. The second stage is what most famously Eshbieg Anderson called decommodification. And this is something that happened especially, but not exclusively, in the middle of the 20th century in social democratic countries in Europe, but of course also happened to some extent elsewhere. And that was a process whereby when capitalism had reached a monopoly stage, or when political opposition to capitalism from Labour had reached a certain stage, the national state, generally the national state, occasionally some supranational or subnational entity, basically appropriated what had been built up by capitalism and reappropriated for the public good. You can think of things like the nationalisation of airports, of railways, of road systems, of electricity, of water supply, also of education, also of health services. Again, this happened differently in different economies and to different degrees in different economies. And I guess the most extreme examples of decommodification can be found in the Nordic countries in the late 20th century, Denmark, Sweden, and so on, which were often held up to the rest of the world as kind of models of what development should look like. You know, with a very tight regulation of labour that was almost universal, with strong social dialogue between national capital and national labour, orchestrated by the national government, and so on. And then the third stage, you could say, again, I'm speaking very generally and crudely, is the recommodification that took place particularly spearheaded in countries like the UK, but also countries like Chile and New Zealand, in the neoliberal era, which was a reprivatisation of what had been in the past decommodified, a recommodification, enabling once more capitalist organisations to make a profit out of activities which in the intervening period had been delivered for their use values and not for surplus value, if you want to use a Marxist technology. So if you think of these three stages and think of economies that are dominated by one or other stage of capitalism, you can see that the introduction of a rather global and universal model of organisation, like, for instance, platformisation, is experienced very, very differently in the different contexts. So if you take somewhere like India, where rural India, let's say, where more than 85% of the economy, up to 90% of the economy is informal, is in the informal sector, then the introduction of platformisation is going to be experienced for many workers as their first encounter with the digital world, their first use of a smartphone for anything other than making phone calls. It might be their first experience of being paid other than in cash. It's their first experience of a kind of what you might call a capitalist disciplining of labour. And of course, in the informal economy, incidentally, I want to, Dimitri mentioned this term informalization, which is used very often in relation to platform work, but I personally think that casualization or precarization is a more useful term, because the informal economy is not necessarily precarious. There are many examples in informal economies of extreme continuity and stability, particularly in family businesses and so on, and in agriculture, where the employment relations are extremely stable. But there are, of course, winners and losers, as in all societies. There are very often very hierarchical levels of organisation. So to go down a little bit further into the example of rural India, for instance, where if platformisation comes along, if you're one of the winners in the informal economy, it's a rather unpleasant competition, which is going to take away work from your little corner shop or from your small hotel or, you know, your food production business or whatever it is. If you're from the bottom of the local hierarchy, if you're of low caste, for instance, if you're treated very badly, it's an enormous opportunity. You see it, you're becoming modern. You're entering this new digitally organised world in which your caste it becomes invisible to somebody on the other side of the world. It represents an enormous opportunity. So I think you have to imagine what it means to different social actors. Whereas if you take a context like Denmark, where people are used to a very high level of regulation of employment and a very good working conditions, good employment protection, the introduction of platformisation is an enormous threat. It's casualising, it's taking away your traditional rights. It's in that context that terms like informalisation can be used. Then you take the third context, you take somewhere like the place where I have the misfortune to live, like London, for instance, which has been quite an extreme victim, if you like, of recommodification. It's not so much experienced as casualisation, although it may be for some workers. It's not so much experienced as a new opportunity, although it may be for some workers. It's kind of business as usual in a different form. It's one among many different options for scrabbling a living out of putting together various different kinds of casual and precarious employment. So I think it's very important not to try to impose universal meanings on something which is actually very relative. So that's my first point, really. As I've already said, these three stages tend to translate into different degrees of informality of employment. I mean, that's not the only measure, but it can be a useful dimension to look at. Thirdly, this applies especially to remote and rural areas, but not exclusively. The formalisation of employment may be linked to a geographical separation between where the employer is based and where the worker is based. And that's quite important. Even if it's formal employment working for the state, a decommodified state, if all the decisions are made in the capital city and you're out in a rural area, there's a kind of loss of local autonomy in terms of decision making. But more importantly, you have to look at where does the value accrue. The value that is created locally used to, in the informal economy, it accrued locally. There's a kind of circulation of value. It may be a poor community, there may not be much value circulating, but the value is nevertheless circulating in that local economy, which is one of the reasons why national states, kind of like formalisation, because it enables them to extract taxes, which are kind of rather difficult to extract in a situation of a highly informal economy. So if you're looking at a remote employer, basically very often all that kind of sticks in the local economy is the wage. The employer may very well not pay taxes locally. If you look at platforms, what is distinctive about platforms, as opposed to other kind of capitalist enterprises that use local labour to create value, is they're using a rentier model. They're taking a rent. Airbnb is taking a rent. A percentage of every rental that takes place in that local community is accruing in another part of the world or another part of the country. So it's being extracted from the local economy. It's the same with a platform like Uber. A local taxi firm, the money accrues to a local proprietors and it's spent in the local economy and it circulates. But Uber is taking 25% very often of the value of each transaction and hoovering it out of the local economy. So again, the wage then becomes very important because the wage is what the local economy gets out of it. So to speak. But there are also the issues about decision making, as I said earlier. It's not just about the money, it's also about where the decisions are made, which can be very important. So my next point, this is really what I want to elaborate on a little bit, because this is very, very neglected in most of the literature about work and employment and development, is that different local economies rest on very different models of social reproduction, which are gendered, which are constructed, culturally constructed. You know, that it's not just an economic phenomenon. The way in which gender relations, what the Scandinavian feminists call the gender contract, the local gender contract, varies a lot, and that actually shapes the labour market in a very fundamental way. What do I mean by social reproduction? I mean the whole range of activities that takes place that in order to produce the worker that the employer needs. The employee arrives at the workplace, clothed and fed and with their health taken care of and with the right skills and with a certain attitude to work, speaking certain languages and with certain cultural knowledge. And all these things are created through various forms of labour that are historically outside the scope of capitalism, but as I will argue later, increasingly being encompassed within the scope of capitalism in a new wave of commodification of the informal economy, you could say. So things to look out for here is the prevailing gender contract, the extent to which there is very often institutionally embodied historically, especially in the more developed European economies, to the extent to which a housewife breadwinner model is locked into the local institutional framework. An awful lot of benefit systems, for instance, in some European countries, not all, but they assume that the male, when the welfare states were created in the mid-20th century, there was a kind of an assumption that the man would earn, unmarried young women might enter the labour market and might remain in the labour market if they never got married, you know, the kind of spinster school teacher kind of syndrome. But generally speaking, the idea was that the male wage was a family wage. It was enough to support a wife and dependent children, that as soon as she got married, a woman would leave the labour force. And that structured all kinds of other institutions, like the opening hours of schools, you know, things like that, and when hospital appointments were available, and so on. So there are very great differences, even within Europe, let alone in other parts of the world. But that's a variable to look out for. And the extent of female labour market participation is a related but different variable. And this is something which has gone up spectacularly in the last 50 years. Women are now more or less half the workforce in most European countries. And this is often considered to be a measure of gender equality by people who look only at the labour market and don't look at social reproduction. And you know, within that, there is even a more tight focus on the so-called gender pay gap. A kind of an assumption, if you solve the gender pay gap, you've achieved women's liberation. Anyway, sorry, I don't want to digress too much, but this is also an important variable to look at. And then it's useful to look at the nature and the extent and the institutional form of the public delivery of services like health, education, childcare, social care, etc., which are, you know, again, this varies enormously from one context to another. In some parts of the world, they almost hardly exist. In other parts of the world, they existed in the late 20th century, but they've been cut back very savagely. In Greece, especially since 2010, since the crisis. But you know, there are huge historical changes in these things, which actually directly impact local labour markets, both in terms of what jobs there are and in terms of how other people are enabled or not to work. And this is often neglected. I think cultural activities and art belong very much in the category of social reproduction. That it's often seen as like a separate sector. Rather ahistorically, in my view, it's seen as like a separate sector of the economy. But it seems to me that it's an integral part of social reproduction, which includes cultural reproduction, of course, right from the very beginning when you teach a child to speak and to sing and to play a musical instrument and so on. So to the extent to which there is or is not state support for arts and cultural activities is quite an important dimension of local economies, in my view. But then you also have to look at what is provided in the market, to what extent there are local laundry facilities, fast food facilities, et cetera, I won't go, hairdressers, all kinds of things. I won't go into a detail about that. So, so that was a quick summary. And I now want to look at social reproduction labour because it takes very many different forms in terms of the relationship of the workers to capitalism. There is unpaid labour, which of course historically represent an awful lot of social reproduction labour, which is carried out without pay by household members or in extended family or in the community. Then there is privately employed labour, which is directly employed by the customer without the intervention of a capitalist firm, which might be a cleaner or a window cleaner or a childcare worker. But it might also be paying a musician to come and play at your wedding, for instance. That same musician who is also in the first category, playing for nothing in the bar, on a Saturday night. And then we have the publicly employed labour, which was a category that was created largely, but not exclusively, in the 20th century, especially in more developed economies. And then finally we have labour employed by companies. Which is for-profit companies, in other words, with a direct relation to capitalists in one way, which might be small capitalists or big capitalists. They might be online platforms, or they might be chains of supermarkets, or whatever. So what has happened? I think it's quite, maybe this is not so relevant for you, but I sort of prepared this slide looking at the relationship of the state to these different forms of labour, because the state, especially in the late 20th century, played quite a strong role in intervening in these various forms of labour. In terms of unpaid labour, it was generally speaking outside the direct control of the state, although there are sort of laws about, you mustn't beat your children and things like that. But also in some countries it was used as a relatively cheap way to deliver social services. For instance, in Italy, the way that care for the elderly is delivered. In a country like Sweden or Denmark, it's delivered by public employees still, or maybe it's changed since I last looked, but it was delivered by state employees. It hadn't yet been privatised. In the UK, it's privatised. In Italy, the household gets a grant from the state with which they can employ their own carer, which very typically is a migrant worker from Romania who can understand Italian but also doesn't have to be paid so much. But I mean, I don't want to overgeneralise, but what my point is that the state does sometimes intervene in the sphere of unpaid labour. Again, in terms of privately employed labour, this is, again, generally outside the scope of the state. It's typically, although there are sometimes grants, to employ, for disabled people to employ helpers and things like that. But again, the workers are generally poorly paid. They're generally migrant workers in Europe. In countries like Brazil, there might be workers from the countryside who have newly arrived in the city, migrant workers, but not international migrant workers. So again, you get different patterns. And then in the public sector, there have been developments mainly in the form of introducing so-called new public management practices and outsourcing, which has made publicly employed member much more stressful, much more intensive, much more tightly managed, in some cases deprofessionalised. And then finally we have labour employed by companies. Again, in the case where public services are outsourced, there is a very direct relationship with the state as the body that commissions the outsourced services. In other cases, the relationship with the state is much more indirect. It's just in its capacity as a general regulator or not of labour. So quickly. Now, all these forms of labour have been transformed very rapidly, very, very rapidly, by first austerity after the financial crisis, but also by marketisation and privatisation, and finally by platformisation. In the case of unpaid labour, the impacts are very contradictory, because it's partly dependent on income and social class. They have enabled more prosperous households to take advantage of new sources of quite cheap informal labour, to substitute for unpaid labour. In the case of poor households, the unpaid labour has been very much intensified, partly because of increasing working hours and reducing income, but also because of austerity, where the public facilities has been closed. So they no longer have free school meals, they no longer have childcare, there's no longer a day centre to take the grandmother to, etc. In terms of publicly employed labour, there were cuts, there were actual job cuts as a result of austerity, but there's also been this intensification, which I talked about earlier, and the introduction of all these awful performance indicators. Anybody here who works in the university has probably experienced some of this. And also even some of the platform practices, like the introduction of user ratings, like rate my professor, that kind of stuff. And finally, if we look at labour that's employed by companies or managed by, I'm including self-employed people in this model, of course, there's been an explosive growth. So more and more workers around the world are working directly, if not as employees, as independent contractors, for very large global companies, or for companies that are local versions of large global companies, or for companies that outsource to local companies. So if we're looking at the direct relation between labour and capital, the number of workers who are in that relationship of alienation, that Marx describes so well, with the direct conflict between the worker and the employer about who gets what percentage of the value that's created and how many hours the workers has to work, etc. That now applies to many more workers around the world than any time before in history, which, depending on your temperament and your politics, might be a cause for hope or a cause for despair. But to move on, to summarise really, we have this changing context, especially in Europe, this applies, a decline in value of the male wage, which is no longer a family wage, except in very exceptional circumstances, which goes along with an expectation that women as well as men should be economically active. It's a requirement now in many countries. You can't receive any kind of benefits unless you prove that you're actively seeking work. But with no increase at all, and in many cases a decrease, in the supply of the services that support the social reproduction. So, the men and women in a household are expected more and more to work and to work longer and longer hours, but the services that support that are largely absent. In fact, in many countries, as I said, there have been major cuts, and this is at a time when there's increasing demand, because of the ageing of the population and so on. There is actually, and also because of the epidemic spread of mental illness, which there's an increasing demand for social services which don't exist, basically. So there is a massive time squeeze on households, doing more and more work with less and less time for social reproduction. Meanwhile, in the broader context, there's been the development of a global division of labour, both through offshoring and through migration. The movement of people to jobs and the movement of jobs to people, if you like. So which has created, I may have remembered to say this, it's created increasingly an interchangeable workforce around the world, which is expected to speak global languages, expected to be digitally literate, and with increasingly standardized skills, standard certifications, but very scattered around the world. And accompanying this development has been at the local level, where employers are taking advantage of this global reserve army of labour, as Marx would have seen it, a breakdown of the traditional kinds of solidarities that existed in the time when the reserve army, the local unemployed people, were people who lived next door to you, whose kids went to the same schools, with whom, in the mid-20th century, with whom you had fought in World War II. Go to the same clinics. So those local sororities have broken down, which has created a breeding ground for a revitalisation of the kinds of enmity between organised labour and the reserve army, which existed before those mid-20th century welfare states came into being. So it becomes a breeding ground for racism, for demonisation, for xenophobia, for recruitment by right-wing parties and so on. So that's all these things are, it seems to be, associated as part of the broader context. And of course, there's been this huge spread of smartphones and other digital technologies. So I'm now going to jump to some empirical work that I did and hope that you will see some connections. But before I start, I think it's useful to, this refers to a series of surveys that I did beginning in 2016 in Europe. But I think it's perhaps useful to give a little bit of a prehistory of platformisation, because I think its genesis is not always well understood. And I won't go all the way back, but in the 1990s, there was an explosive growth of what was at the time called offshore outsourcing. Companies that got their software developed in India, or they put call centres in the Philippines, or et cetera, et cetera. And this was, if you like, making available that global reserve army of labour that I spoke about earlier to employers in the global north, mainly. But it was actually only big companies that could do it. There were big transaction costs involved. It was quite expensive to go to Bangalore and to find a building and to negotiate with the local authorities to get the right kind of permits and the right kind of leases, and to work with a recruitment company to recruit the workers. And there was a very high failure rate. Statistically, I think one software project in 3 failed. And some people will even say only 1 in 3 succeeds. There was a lot of cost. And so although there was a global army of labour available, it was only available to certain kinds of companies. And towards the end of the 90s, a new model appeared where people became intermediaries, a new kind of, you could call them being traditional concept, a comprador class in some developing countries, who became that, like the Mr. Fix-Its, come to me and I will find you your workers, and I will, etc. By around 2004, 2005, this developed into yet another business model, which was platforms like Amazon Mechanical Turk, freelancers, Odesk, Elance, which used a different model, mostly based in Silicon Valley, not all of them. Freelance, I think, started in Australia, I may be wrong. But they started around 2004, 2005. Amazon in particular already had the infrastructure for processing international payments through its, buying books and so on. So it was particularly easy for Amazon to do, to set up Amazon Mechanical Turk. So what these platforms did was they acted as intermediaries. They made available the labour of the global reserve army for the first time really, to small companies, even to individuals, to SMEs. They de-risked it. And they did that but through this rentier model. They took a percentage of the money, and the platform became a way to connect labour to customers. And so this model was more or less successful in relation to services like software development, graphic design, translation, editing, various kind of activities that were already highly digitalized that didn't require face-to-face contact. So you've got that kind of slowly growing. And then along comes the financial crisis, 2007, 2008. And a major need for capital to restructure itself. And in particular, in the immediate aftermath, a complete shortage of credit. It was almost impossible to get credit after the financial crisis. The banks wouldn't lend anything to anyone because of, I won't go into the details of it. And in Silicon Valley, around that time, 2010, 2011, and that the business model that had already been developed by platforms like Amazon Mechanical Turk and so on began to be adopted by companies like Airbnb and Uber, for instance. Both started in 2011. TaskRabbit, I think, started maybe 2012. Anyway, around that time. And it was like an answer to prayer to these capitalists, because they couldn't get the credit and anyway didn't want to invest in bricks and mortar and invest in fleets of cars and all these kind of depreciating assets, or assets in the case of property that required maintenance and so on. It was, what a gift it was to be able to get other people to invest in these things, to take out mortgages on their houses, to take out loans to buy new cars, etc., to give them work using this rental model, this taking a percentage model. And so these were extremely successful, 2011, 2012. They hit Europe on the whole about 2013, was when most of the platforms arrived in Europe, some a little bit earlier, some later. And it so happened, by coincidence, here's my biography coming in, between 2012 and 2016, I was the chair of a cost action in which Marta was also involved, where we were starting to look at these platforms. In my capacity as editor of a journal, I'd already published an article in 2011 by a guy called Brett Carraway on Odesk. So I was already a little bit familiar with the Odesk model. And then we had some people in the cost action, Martha will remember them, who were doing research on other kinds of online platforms. So we started to pull together all the information that we could through the cost action on these online platforms, which were seen as a very new phenomenon. And in 2015, I was invited to speak to the European Parliament not about the impact on labour of online platforms, which it hadn't occurred to them at that point that there was an impact on labour. I was asked to speak about the impact on consumer rights. They had a very big interest in promoting online platforms, because they saw it as part of the digital single market project. They were really passionate about creating a digital single market in Europe, by which they meant things like if you had a software license in Germany, you could also use it in France. It was this kind of transferability, and they saw digital platforms as very much part of this phenomenon, which was going to help develop Europe, it was going to help cohesiveness, it was going to create new kinds of jobs, it was, seen as entirely positive. But they were a little bit worried that consumer rights were not going to be... Anyway, so I did a talk where I pointed out that you couldn't talk about consumer rights without also talking about worker rights. If something was going to be a health hazard to a consumer, there was also going to be a health hazard to the worker, for example, if you look at health and safety now. So anyway, and out of that developed some kind of interactions between the cost action, between the policymakers, and at the end of 2015, I was asked to do a study looking at the impact of online platforms on, would you believe, on the tax and benefit systems. They were worried that tax wouldn't be paid and that, and I said, look, we can't do this until we know how big it is. We need to know the scale of the phenomenon. And nobody knew the scale of the phenomenon. All there were some market studies because nobody'd worked out a methodology for working out the scale of the problem, and they really didn't like paying for surveys at all. But in the end, I persuaded them, as long as it didn't come to more than 10,000 euros, to pay for a very small survey by adding some questions to an omnibus survey in one country, so we could just test the methodology and see if it was actually possible to measure. It's always difficult to measure something where there's no definition of the thing that you're measuring, right? It requires, anyway. So that's like my little introduction to, so because there is no definition, can you read this? Sorry, the print is very small here. So what you need to do, if you don't have a definition, is you need to make what statisticians call constructed variables. You need to cross-tabulate one thing with another. And I have a bit of experience of this from my sins, because in the 1980s, 1990s, I was designing surveys to measure telework, which was then an unknown concept, and in the 90s to measure offshore outsourcing. So in the case of teleworking, for instance, I'm really sorry about this small print. You look at the type of work people are doing, you look at where they are working, and then you look at where their employer or their client is based, and then you look at how they communicate with the clients, and then you look at what proportion of their time they are, is this a significant aspect of the work or not? And from that you could produce various typologies of teleworker, occasional teleworkers, mobile teleworkers, etc. But you could measure it, is the point. In the case of offshore outsourcing, for different business functions, you look at where is the demand based, where is the supply based, how permanent is the relationship, is it outsourced or is it carried out by employees, is it like a remote office or is it an outsourced relationship between companies, etc. So there are ways you do it, but you need think a little bit outside the box to do it. So in the case of platform work, we looked at both supply and demand. And in the case of the work, we looked at whether somebody had found work via an app or a website in the last week or month or whatever. But we also, before we did that, we had to exclude, like people who just were using job search websites, for instance, to find a permanent job. So we had separate questions about that, so we could exclude those people. We also, incidentally, if anybody's interested, the data are all available publicly on the University of Hertfordshire website. We also looked at other ways people generated an income online. So we've got statistics on people who use platforms like Airbnb to rent out rooms. We've got statistics on people who use platforms like Etsy to sell handicraft products and things like that, which might be relevant to some of your work. So we also looked at people who were buying and selling on their own websites. Quite a lot of people do that. So anyway, but I'm going to focus here just on labour. And we also asked for various... Sorry? Yeah, I'll go quickly. We also asked technical things to find out whether it really, how controlling the app was. Did they use the app to be informed of new work? Did they have to use the app to get a new task? Did the app record the time that they worked, etc.? And was their work rated by customers? And etc. We had a rather simple typology of platform work. We put in different categories: online work, which is only online in global labour markets, like Upwork, for instance, or Clickworker. We looked at driving and delivery work, like Uber and Deliveroo and Foodora and stuff like that. We looked at work that's carried out in other people's homes, like childcare and household maintenance and cleaning and stuff like that. And we looked at errands, which is a bit of a catch-all category. People who just use an app for people who wanted like a task, a one-off task, to take something from A to B or something like that. So I'm not going to show you lots and lots of results. I'm going to just show you some key results. This, just to make certain points. Now this slide shows you the people who are using an app or a website to be notified when work is available, which is one of our indicators of, if you like, digital management. And the blue bars are the people who say they work for platforms at least weekly. The orange bars are people who say they work at least monthly. And the grey bars are people who don't work for platforms. This is important, because this shows you to the extent to which these digital management practices have spread right across the labour market from platforms. Now, these surveys were done in different countries at different times. So, but in one country, which is the UK, we did the first trial survey in the UK, but we were able to revisit again in 2019. So we were able to see the growth. And in that 3-year period, you can see there was enormous. The platform, there was a doubling of weekly platform work just in that, which is an awful lot if you think, in just in a 3-year period. And there was also a very strong growth in digital management of non-platform workers. Right, so that's all I really need to tell you about that. I'm now going to double down onto social reproduction work, defined very narrowly. This excludes artistic and cultural work. This is household services delivered by platforms in other people's homes. There's people working in other people's homes. And what's really interesting, you can see also the rate of growth over the 3-year period. What's interesting about this is the orange bars are the demand, the people who use platforms for these services. The blue bars at the top are the people who work for these platforms, who supply the services. And as the kind of traditional feminist sociologist, if you like, what I would imagine, what I was expecting, was that this was showing like a bourgeoisie who are like the employees of these services, and like a new servant class, probably made up largely of migrant workers, who are supplying these services. But no, look at the grey bars. The grey bars below are the people who do both. And in most countries, around more than 85% of platform workers are also users of platform services. So this is an exchange of services within the working class, if you like. It's something different from the old master-servant relationships that we're used to seeing, which of course still exist, but very often don't involve platforms. Platforms are much more used by the poor. I mean, there is a slight difference if we look at the social class of the people using the platforms. There is a difference, but not a big difference, between people of middle income and people of lower income. So this is an interesting phenomenon. So the only way we can understand this is in the context of that household time crunch that I was speaking about earlier, is what we have. You can start anywhere on this circle. You have workers who need extra income, because you have to remember that the income, after the financial crisis, incomes have been really flattened for workers. They need extra income. The survey tells us most people who do platform work are doing it on top of another job. They're not doing it full time. They are only getting maybe 10% of their income from it, but they need that extra 10%. So the workers need extra income, so they work longer hours. And this means they have less time for housework. And this creates a time crunch. It's not just an economic crunch. It's effective. It affects family relationships. It means people are fighting about who's going to do the laundry. It means the kids are neglected and they're up in their rooms looking at porn and nobody's got time to keep an eye on them. It means families break down. It means people become mentally ill. I mean, it's really very toxic, the impact of this time crunch on households. So what do people do? They turn to the market for the services that they cannot produce for themselves. They're too tired to cook, so they order a pizza. You know, they don't have, the laundry is piling up, and they've been targeted on their mobile phone with a special offer that somebody will come and do 2 hours ironing for you with an introductory offer of €10, you know, or or they have to work in the evening, and they use a babysitting app for somebody to come and babysit for them so they can go out and do their work. So, but because they're using the market for these households, and they're also doing things like buying ready meals, you know, instead of raw ingredients and stuff like that. But I won't go into that. But because they're using the platforms are growing. And so you've then got a growth of precarious work. You've got a growth of people who need this extra income. And as I'll show you quickly during the pandemic, what a lot of the platforms did is they started over-recruiting. So people have to wait longer and longer to find work on platforms since 2019. In 2020. And then, so round and round the circle you go. So we have a crisis of social reproduction, which is really intensifying very, very rapidly, very rapidly. So this is what's happened since the pandemic. I'm being really quick now. But we did only in the UK, we were able to do a follow-on survey in 2021, but only in England and Wales. So it's slightly different figures because we couldn't get money for Scotland and Northern Ireland. So this is what you can see, the 2016, 2019, 2021. Platform work has just basically gone on growing. I won't go into detail, but it's quite significant. So we now have around 20% of workers, if you take a broad definition, who've done some kind of platform work, which is, yeah, that's 1 in 5. That's a hell of a lot. This is, as you can see, in terms of the type of platform work, not surprisingly, because of the nature of the pandemic, the driving and delivery work, which was the least important back in 2016, that green line, has gone up faster, and so it's overtaken both the errands and the household work. Again, the slightly slower growth in household work is partly explained because in the pandemic you weren't allowed to have people in your home because of the lockdown rules. But the online work is still the most important. It's still the most important. So, you know, don't forget the online work. But, and it's a big but, although the number of platform workers has gone up very dramatically, the proportion of their income which they're deriving from platform work has gone down. And this is explained by the qualitative work that I did in another project, which I won't tell you about, but this is done by the fact that the platforms had, it looks like an absolute systematic strategy of over-recruiting. You see it with Uber, you see it with Deliveroo, you see it with lots of platforms. The pandemic gave them an opportunity because there were people around who didn't have work to do, or sometimes protected by furlough payments, in some cases not, who were available, so they just went on recruiting. So you can interview an Uber driver who could say, well, now I have to wait 2 hours for my next fare, and 3 years ago I could find one in 5 minutes. You know, so there's the time spent looking for work is going up, but the proportion of the income coming from it is going down. And this has been associated with a masculinization of the workforce. And I think this is because women just simply don't have the time to spend all those hours on the street waiting for work or looking for platform work. Because I've looked at the driving and delivery work is the second, is particularly noticeable in the driving and delivery work, this masculinization of the workforce. So anyway, I'll stop there. In summary, platformisation continues to spread, so does the precarisation of labour. Platform workers are putting in longer hours to earn proportionately less, so the household time crunches are intensifying. And there is, you could say, a general crisis of social reproduction going on. Historically unprecedented, I would think. Enormous. And then I'll only come to this if I have time. Platform is part of the problem, but could platform technologies also be part of the solution? But there's one more slide I want to share with you. I'll go to the other one only if there's time. I think this is general lessons for assessing the impacts of initiatives in rural development. First, ask yourself, these are questions to ask, what value is generated? To whom does it accrue? Where does the money end up? You know, these are very simple questions, but they might help you assess what you're looking at. If new work is created, how well paid is it? How secure is it? How satisfying is it? And who gets it? By implication, who doesn't get it also. How and to what extent does a new initiative draw from the local economy to satisfy the social reproduction needs of the participants? For instance, you create this really cool co-working space that all the digital nomads, love using. Are they just using the local economy as a way to get their cleaning done, as a way to get their food delivered, as a way, or are they giving back in some way to the local community? So that my next bullet point is related, because you look at what they're taking in terms of social reproduction services and look at what they're giving back. Now, it could be, like some of the family businesses you heard about yesterday, that they are giving back, that they're building a local kindergarten, that they're building a playground, that they're creating a new health centre, for example. But it could be that they are not as well. I mean, these are things to look at. So, do you want my last slide or not? Yes. Okay, right. This is basically, it does. Oh, yes. Towards broader political solutions. Here we go. Some of them are not so relevant for you, perhaps, but it's clear that politically the framework of workers' rights that we inherited from the mid-20th century is no longer fit for purpose. It applies to a smaller and smaller proportion of the workforce. And it seems to me that we need a new Charter of Universal Rights. And that includes a clear definition of self-employment, which doesn't exist in most countries, although the EU is trying, actually. And once you have a clear definition of self-employment, which works for tax purposes, which works for employment law purposes, and which works for social insurance and pensions and so on, then you have to say everybody else who's being paid for their labour time is de facto a dependent employee, right? And once you have that framework, you can say, here are the universal rights that apply to all dependent employees, regardless of whether or not they have a formal contract of employment. They have holiday rights, they have sick pay rights, they have the right to join a trade union, etc., etc., etc. But on top of those kind of what you might call traditional rights inherited from the 20th century, we need new rights for the digital age. The right to challenge an unfair decision made by an algorithm, for instance, based on false facial recognition, which comes up an awful lot, especially with black people, black skin, the facial recognition tends to work better with white skin. For example, you have the right to communicate directly with the platform, with the boss, not via the app, because very often people get dropped by the app and then suddenly they have no way to communicate. Or in one case, a poor Uber driver I met, his mobile phone was stolen by a customer. and Uber wouldn't give him the name or the details, so he could give them to the police of who that customer was. And so he was left without his livelihood, without his information. So anyway, there should be like a helpline that you can call regardless, without going through the app. And this also applies incidentally in institution environments like universities. You should be able to query your time allocation or your expense claims or whatever without going through an app, But anyway, that's by the by. But you also need rights, for instance, to know what happens to the data that is used, to see the algorithm. There's a test case going on in Amsterdam right now between some Uber drivers and Uber. The right to see the algorithm, because under the new trade agreements, algorithms are considered to be private intellectual property, which means that they're secret. Which means that, for instance, a trade union safety representative who thinks that the way the algorithm is being used is damaging to the health and safety of workers doesn't have the right to see the algorithm, which is in conflict with the rights to information that ought to be available to health and safety reps. So, I mean, there are a whole lot of issues about the right to, I won't go into in detail, but anyway, so let's move on. Of course, we need to reform the tax benefit system. But let's not go there right now. Another, it seems to me, really important demand is the decommodification of digital infrastructures. In the 20th century, some infrastructures were considered rightly so important that they were seen as universal services that should be under public control, like electricity and water and so on. It seems to me that broadband should go into that category. Why not demand that it's a public utility? Even social media platforms, should they not be public utilities? Things like Facebook that are so. If brave social democratic governments in the 20th century appropriated these things, why cannot it be done in the 21st century? Especially now that the neoliberal ideas are so discredited, because one of the positive things to come out of the pandemic was a sudden public understanding that this neoliberal myth that there is no alternative to the market is indeed a myth, because the pandemic showed that you actually need the state to intervene, crucially. This might be some... Anyway, again, I won't go there in detail. Finally, it seems to me that the platform technologies under public control could be used very positively to deliver new kinds of public service, to create a new kind of digitally based welfare state fit for the 21st century. If Deliveroo can be used to give old people, to match supply and demand, and give give somebody the meal that they want when they want it, why can it not be used to deliver meals to sick people, to elderly people, to centres for homeless people, to kids with special diets in schools, whatever? You could actually organise a completely different bottom-up food delivery system locally that would also be very green in terms of you could use it to redistribute leftover food from restaurants. You could use it for people who grow tomatoes in small supplies locally. It could distribute them to local markets in times of glut, etc. You could actually build a local food infrastructure, but under local control in a bottom-up way. Not substituting for existing provision, but alongside it as an option. The same with transport. Why not use an Uber-type service under public control to get people to their hospital appointments, to take kids to school? It doesn't have to be. You don't have to be giving a rent to somebody in California every time you use a taxi. There are alternative ways to do it. And the household support services. And people always argue that the platforms work because of the economies of scale, because of the so-called network effect. You use Airbnb because they will have the most properties available. So if you go to an alternative platform, there will be less choice in the city that you want to go to, etc. You use Uber because an Uber is likely to come along quicker than another platform because they have more drivers. But you can turn that logic on its head And instead of talking about the network effect across a particular function, you could have a multi-function local platform. So you could have like the Ceros platform that you go to when you want a taxi to the airport, when you want somebody to come and fix your washing machine, when you want to rent out your room. That could all be on a Ceros local platform, under local control, and able, through the economies of scale, to give decent wages and conditions to the worker. Instead of that 25% going to California, it'd be going into pension schemes, into paying social insurance, into paying for holiday pay and sick pay and so on. There are really lots and lots of opportunities. And finally, I would, and of course, infrastructure for cultural goods and services as well. For distributing music and organising gigs and, whatever. So my final point is, how about looking at developing some pilot platforms in rural areas, but under the control of local actors and in response to a consultation with local actors about actually what services what they need. Could this be an interesting way forward? I'll stop there. Thank you. Sorry for gone over time.
Thank you for a really interesting, really insightful, and very, very informative talk. So I think now Nikos and Alexandra might want to make some points or initiate the discussion with you. Nico, Alexandra, which one should start?
I can start. Okay. First of all, many thanks for your presentation. It was super enjoyable, and I'm happy that we're having this conversation now that is super informed from social theory, which I think that somehow lacks when it comes to the collaborative workspaces literature. Sometimes I have the impression that we're thinking of co-working spaces as if they were sprouting in absence of the system, of the social and economic system that they are taking part of, the capitalist system. So I think that it was super interesting. So I have mainly two questions. I'll go through the first one and then we can see if we can manage the time. First of all, we know that in more community-led co-working spaces and in comparison to the ones that are more business-oriented, and they have a curator that is paid to take care of the social reproduction of the space, let's say, and of the needs of the users, etc., etc. In community-led working spaces, we have more the fact that this kind of social reproductive work is distributed to the users of the space because they're their members sometimes, etc. Maybe could it mean that this kind of distribution of reproductive work could raise awareness of the fact that reproductive work is sentimental for social reproduction? And I'm talking about the feminization of work as well. So male co-working users might have to take care of the space itself, take care of the atmosphere that is being reproduced there. Might that initiate visibility of the necessity of reproductive work? Initiating a discursive, a discourse about the need. Yeah, recognition of reproductive work. That would be the first question.
Well, that's a big question. I mean, there have been lots of attempts over the years to try to find ways of making social reproduction work more visible. I mean, I guess classically among feminists it's been around childcare campaigns, making sure that there are not just creches for small children, but play spaces in local community for older kids. I mean, one of the really tough things about bringing up the kids in the countryside, I find with my grandchildren, is that there are a lack of the kind of facilities that you find in a big city, like to take them to a puppet show on a Saturday, to take them the soft play space, or somewhere to go when it rains where you can entertain the kids and so on. There is a lot of scope for creating kind of play and leisure spaces, and sporting facilities also can be an issue. Places where kids can learn music and learn dance and learn art. And these are all things that, in principle, a co-working centre could offer. They could offer different kinds of training, but I tend not to see kids as their target audience, so to speak. And they tend also not to see women as their target audience. And for women, for some women especially, women from ethnic minorities, for example, they can be the gatekeepers can be very intimidating. The gatekeeper, traditional gatekeepers can also be intimidating. I mean, even libraries are usually, in most cities, librarians are usually quite good at creating kind of welcoming spaces for local users, and including things like taking the books around in buses. You get quite a lot of rural library experiments that are quite nice, but even librarians can be scary. Like if you're a Muslim woman and it's a white man, and you're going to feel judged that you don't speak the language very well or something like that. But even more intimidating, or a Catholic priest, who is the gatekeeper for using the local church hall. These kind of things can be. But even more intimidating, I would argue, is the kind of the cool, nerdy hipster with the beard. You have to really think about who you involve in these welcoming excluding roles as gatekeepers. I think that's part of it, and I think people very often go through a process of consultation with local actors, but which local actors do they pick? That's actually a political question. I think you need to give some thought to that. So it's really important to work with local groups, but kind of in quite a modest way. And it may be that what they want isn't what you think is appropriate to give them. There are different values. It might be quite difficult for the people setting up the co-working space to decide that what the local people really want is somewhere to come and do gospel singing in part of their church group or something like that. But it seems to me a very sensitive dialogue and a bottom-up initiative. A bottom-up approach is very, very important. And in developing local platforms, you have to consult not only with people who would be beneficiaries, but also with local actors who might be threatened by this development, who might see it as in competition with them. In the UK, that would be particularly the local authority trade unions, who would very much resist an opening up of the public sphere to new kinds of workers under possibly new kinds of contracts and new kinds of job descriptions and so on. So it needs a very sensitive dialogue among local actors. But I think the bottom-up principle is very important, because one of the reasons why all these brave 20th century experiments in decommodification failed or didn't have enough public support to keep them was because they operated in a very top-down way, and they operated in a way that was often indistinguishable from the way that capitalist enterprises worked. So people working for nationalised industries and people working for government bodies, okay, they had maybe better working conditions in some ways than the private sector, but they saw it as another boss. And they took the forms of trade union action that they would have taken against a private employer, and they resented the bureaucracy in the way that they would, and a lot of people, and they found it inefficient in various ways because of the bureaucratization. So people didn't fight very hard to keep them. They often thought, oh yeah, they believed this stuff about the market will give us something better, and the market will give us something cheaper, and the market will give us something more efficient. So you have to, I think if we want to build new forms of decommodification, it has to be done in a way that's very sensitive to those sort of perceptions, where I don't want to sound too sort of hippie about this, because obviously you need institutions, you need structures, you need rules of fairness and so on, but it does have to be built from the bottom up if you want people to feel local ownership of it. And it's only if they feel local ownership of it Like the one institution in the UK that people feel a local ownership of is the National Health Service. They feel it's like, it's our National Health Service, we're going to fight for that. It's partly because everybody knows somebody who works in it, but it's also part of the historical origins of the National Health Service. Unlike the insurance-based health schemes of most European countries, the British National Health Service was built on local experiments in the same way that some of the social experiments some of you are working with. In the town of Tredegar in South Wales, the steel workers and the mine workers in the 1880s, they formed local health associations. They paid a membership fee, and then as members they were able to take advantage of when they were sick, and it built up and it built up. And during the 1920s, when there was mass unemployment, it was already extended to the families of workers. It was extended to unemployed workers. And by the 1930s, 95% of the population of Tredegar were covered by this scheme. They had their own hospitals, they employed their own doctors, they employed their own nurses. And that's when Nye Bevan grew up, who was the Labour politician who founded the National Health Service. There were also experiments there was one in Peckham in South London, where a group of radical doctors created a community health centre that focused on preventative health. So the children were given good diets and, the mums, etc. But the point is, these local experiments can become building blocks for new models, which can then, if the time is right politically, can then be adopted at a national level or at a higher level. But it seems to be really important to start at the local level. And the other reason it's good to start at the local level is because it's much better for people to put their political energies into something where you win something than to be constantly losing. There's nothing more depressing than to campaign at an abstract level against globalization, against your horrible right-wing government, against neoliberalism, and have the experience of being a loser, of constantly being a loser. It's much better to build something quite small, but to be a winner, and then you can build on that politically. Right, anyway, sorry, rather a long answer.
Many thanks.
Yes. My question, much of it has been addressed already, but maybe to get back to a point where you said that many collaborative organizations are not addressing women, or don't seem to address women particularly. There are these women-only or female-centered co-working spaces, especially in urban areas. From the US, for example, there's this the Wing example, which now has become it's a chain basically now, and it's been much criticized as well, putting forth stereotypes like all in pink and whatever. So that was my question. What do you think about them, or how could we create them? More from a bottom-up level or less commercial. And the second was regarding the childcare services. Some spaces, again, mainly or exclusively in urban areas, are offering these integrated childcare services. And now there is the question whether this is not, again, just a commodification of social reproductive labor.
Yeah. Well, I think there are very many different ways you can appeal to women. You can appeal to them in their capacities as mothers, as male main childcare providers, for example, and focus on childcare facilities which immediately liberate them to do something else if there's a childcare facility, and liberate them spatially as well from being anchored in the home. But you can also appeal to women by focusing on particular occupations or sectors of the economy. There are examples of that, for instance, in Greece in the 1950s, in Mykonos, when all the men were working in German car factories. There was a very interesting local experiment, which, you look at Mykonos and you think, is this the future? You would have wished for it. But anyway, basically a cooperative was formed based on weaving, because that was what women traditionally knew how to do. And so women were organized, if you like, and addressed in their capacities as weavers. You can also you can look at the local economy and you can see in what kinds of activity women are concentrated, and then you can focus initiatives on those. In Morocco, for instance, there was quite an interesting project where there were a lot of widowed women who were having real trouble finding work in the local labour market, and a cooperative was set up to process argan oil. Argan oil is, argan nuts. You see those photographs of goats climbing trees in Morocco? The argan nuts are harvested by the goats and pass through their bodies. and then oil is made from them, which is used in the beauty industry. And it's very delicious, actually, oil on salads. If you forget the fact it's passed through the gut of a goat on its way. But anyway, but the point was, because this was something that women knew how to do, and they were doing it in the informal economy, it was possible to build an industry, but focused on these women's skills and giving them a say in how it was organised. There are many, many examples around the world of various crafts-based activities that have taken that kind of an approach. But it seems to me that obviously it's good to involve women at all stages. If you've got women in the team, they are more likely to be sensitive to these issues. But I think as soon as you adopt a gender-sensitive lens, you start to see things that are invisible if you don't look in that way. I was very struck by, a couple of days ago, these very interesting presentations of these different bodies that you were presenting, and nobody mentioned childcare facilities. I know actually from other conversations that some of them include childcare facilities, but nobody mentioned this as an important dimension. And to me, that's a crucially important dimension. If anybody who's got children or grandchildren knows that it's an important dimension. But so maybe it also having a spectrum of ages is quite useful as well. Having older people might bring a different perspective to some of the discussions, because they will also have a memory of what the old practices were in the informal economy. I think it's very important to look at, if you're looking at any new activities, to look at what they're substituting for. I mean, this Airbnb model, it's not new to rent out a room on a Greek island. In the 1960s, when I was travelling among Greek islands, you could go to the tourist office or you could ask on the harbour, does anybody know where I can find a room? And somebody would find you a room. And that room would be a family bedroom, and the people would move out and sleep on the roof in the summer, or sleep with the sheep in the, or whatever, in the winter. They would clear out of their room to make some money in cash from a tourist. So it's not a new idea to rent out a room. But, when you handed over your few drachma in the 1960s for this room, it stayed in the local economy. 25% of it wasn't being hoovered out to California. And it's the same with co-working spaces, actually. They're very often substituting for internet cafes, for instance. Small internet cafes, which are part of the local informal economy, where kids go to play video games, where people go to do their homework, but also where people go to do their work for Upwork, or Clickworker, but where they meet backpackers and learn new things, and so on. And you're not doing anything especially revolutionary by displacing internet cafes, So you have to always look at who's being displaced as well as what work is being created. It may be that the guy who runs the internet cafe is totally obnoxious and racist, and that you need something else. But be sensitive to it.
Colm and then Sunji. I don't know. Maybe the other way around. Who put the answer first?
Yeah, thank you, Ursula. Just I found it very interesting when you were touching just on that last question by Alex about cooperatives in Morocco, the Argentine, etc. Do you think that there's a role for platform cooperatives in developing, for example, these pilot, locally owned platforms for localities, or do you have experience or know existing examples?
Well, it's a very fashionable idea. There are lots and lots of these local platform co-ops being set up around the world, promoted by all sorts of bodies. There's kind of an association, a guy called Trevor Schultz in New York runs, he's got a lot of money, he managed to get a lot of government money to set up training schools and so on. He's Austrian originally, but he's based in New York. And in Brazil, in India, I mean, everybody's very excited by this idea. I'm old enough to remember various cooperatives that were set up in the 1970s particularly, some of which were successful and many were not. And I think it's always good. It's always good to show people that there's an alternative. And it's nice. People learn a lot from being involved in setting up a platform, but it seems to me they have their limitations. One of the limitations is they're very, very difficult to scale up. You can have 6 people who all understand what everyone else is doing, who work in a very cooperative way, and then it grows to 20 people, and you might you don't know what everybody doesn't know what everybody else is doing, but you maybe break into 4 different groups, and each group, they know what everybody's doing. But then you scale above that, and you start having to bring in rules and democratic structures and meetings where people vote, and people start playing power games, and especially because there's a tendency across the voluntary sector as well as in cooperatives to attract a certain sort of personality who wants to be a big fish. But an easy way to be a big fish is to find a small pond. I don't want to. I mean, I guess we've all met some of those people, and you know, so you get the personal politics very much mixed up with the politics, and then people taking positions that this is politically incorrect, and various kinds of entries, so I mean, it can be done and it can work very well, but it doesn't always work very well. But the main issue about economy is about economy of scale and the network effect. If you're a small alternative to Deliveroo and you're in a small town and you've got 30 riders, but Deliveroo is working alongside you and they've got 2,000 people on their books, then people are going to use Deliveroo, partly because it's more likely a user-friendly app and it's targeting them with special offers all the time, but also simply because you know the rider will come more quickly because there are more riders, you know, and they're disciplined in a different way. But as I said, there are ways to get around it, but it seems to me that to include public sector actors, that comes with its own problems, I mean, huge problems, depending on the particular political persuasion of the local municipality, and depending on all sorts of other things. But it seems to me there's a bigger chance of building economies of scale if you work with existing public sector actors, simply because they're bigger, and also because they can deliver a market. For instance, if you have a platform supplying meals, you have, and there are public sector cuts going on, so the hospitals are closing their kitchens and buying in food from outside, which is typically happening in the UK, for instance, and so are the schools. If you set up a local food delivery platform and a food supply platform, then you've got a ready-made market to the local hospitals, to the local schools, to the canteen of the local police station, to whatever. So it's much easier to achieve economies of scale. And it's also, they could also have a leverage, you know, for example, with public with increasingly firms, since the pandemic, are moving to hybrid forms of work, where people only go into work maybe 2 days a week and work from home the rest of the week, for instance. That means it's no longer viable to have a workplace canteen. You could maybe negotiate with local employers like a voucher system, you know, so they can deliver food on the 2 days a week that somebody is there. If you look outside Europe, there's some very interesting ways that the local state has intervened in relation to platforms. For instance, in some Indian cities during the lockdown, they gave licenses to food delivery platforms, mostly local Indian ones like Zomato and so on, to deliver food from the supermarkets. But of course in India most people buy food from street markets and from street vendors. And India being the kind of democracy it is, the local politicians, they need the votes, you know, of all the millions of street vendors and market traders. So they actually made it a condition, the platforms, they couldn't get a license unless they took the food from the street market and from the vendors to the customers. So that was a way that the platform was obliged by the state, if you like, to work with the local informal economy in a way that was quite progressive and interesting. And that maybe that could provide a model in other contexts.
Thank you very much for your inspiring talk. And I have one question and one mixture of question and comment. What struck me in the statistics that you collected was that, for instance, there were countries with the highest share of non-platform work, the gray arrows. At the same time, they had the highest share of online work. And this was interesting, and I was wondering if you could elaborate on that a little bit, how this can be explained. And the second point is, to understand platformization, maybe if we look, like in our work, we looked at the user from the user perspective. We investigated fashion designers and how they design and how platforms come into play. And if you have a user perspective, you will see that there's a multiplicity of platforms that they work with. Some with direct income, others for branding, others with mixed functions. And here a new form of unpaid labor comes in, negotiating, just like deciding where to spend my time. In the design studio, on Etsy, on Instagram, and for work purpose. So there's a huge amount of unpaid work related to coordinating platform work as well, adding to the vicious cycle, so to speak, that you showed us. Comment and question.
That's very, very interesting. I mean, part of the explanation in terms of those statistics I presented is simply the fact that some surveys were done later than others. Platformisation was expanding so fast, as we saw in the growth in the UK. So the surveys that were done in 2019 picked up much higher levels of incidence than those that were done in 2016 and 2017. So it's partly that. But it's also partly, and this was very interesting in terms of presenting the results of these surveys, because we, under the rules of the funding that we had to be a local partner, had to pay for at least 25% of the cost of the survey in each country. And so we had local sponsors for each survey. And a lot of them really didn't want to believe our results. There was a lot of hostility. In some countries, they refused to publish them. And that was because it revealed certain assumptions. In the first stage, there was an assumption that platform work was associated with being economically advanced and high levels of internet users and high skills. And so they were expecting, very, very high levels in places like Stockholm and, and what we in fact found was that the levels were highest in the regions where there is already a very high informal economy, where there are a lot of migrants, especially new migrants, and it kind of makes sense. You've used your smartphone to make your difficult journey from Afghanistan or from Africa to get to the south of Italy or Spain or wherever. Or every step of the way you need to use your smartphone to keep contact with your family, to find out where you're going, to find out which routes are safe and which are not. And you arrive in a strange city and you need some money, and so what more obvious thing to do than to use your smartphone to find a quick income? So, you can expect it, but this isn't what they wanted to hear. And especially in Italy, they expected to find the highest levels in places like Milan, which are the most industrially developed, and instead there were much higher levels in coastal areas in the south and so on. And in Germany, the trade unions, also in Austria actually, the trade unions who put money into the survey couldn't believe how high the levels were, and they got kind of quite angry. And in one case, a German trade union commissioned another survey to try to disprove our results, and were a little embarrassed when it came up with almost identical results. Because they were saying, well, you know, these are our members. We represent, in Austria, we represent 85% of the workforce, and we would know about it if our members are doing all this extra work on the side and so on. But actually people are doing, typically they're doing it on top of another job. And typically it's very high in tourist areas because the work is so seasonal. It makes sense that you switch from one activity to another at a different time of the year. And the same in agricultural regions, which are also touristic reasons. It kind of absolutely makes sense that you switch from one activity to another. So as I say, the results are now less surprising to people because there's now a couple of generations of PhD students have gone out and done, typically they've joined Deliveroo and done ethnographic research on Deliveroo riders because they're easy to find. You find much less research on cleaners or people working for Upwork and so on, because it's a much bigger challenge as a researcher to get a sample. But sorry, there was another half to your question which I've forgotten.
More a comment that if you change your perspective and look from user perspective, you see how platforms are.
Oh yeah, there's an awful lot of, and this is something that grew very much during the pandemic, was as the supply of work became scarcer from any one platform, the multi-apping as we call it, you will find an Uber driver and then it will have 3 different phones with 3 different apps. One is Bolt, one is Uber, one is whatever, Ola I think is another one. And with Upwork, people, they work for Fiverr, they work for Upwork, they work for people per hour, they work for, if they're a graphic designer, they'll work for one of the more specialist design platforms and so on. One of the things that they get very, very angry about is that you can't transfer, you build up a high customer rating on one platform, but you can't transfer that to another platform. And this actually creates there's a new kind of entrepreneurship developing, whereby somebody in, I don't know, let's say Azerbaijan or somewhere like that, they build up a good user profile on, let's say, Upwork, and then they use that high user profile to bid for jobs which they then pass down informally to people who are effectively employees. And so they become an intermediary in a new value chain, effectively. And this happens a lot because although there's a lot of evidence that you still earn less if you're in a developing country than you do in the global north on a platform. Also, women still earn less than men even though they're doing the same tasks. But nevertheless, there is a convergence towards a kind of global wage. So if you're in Berlin or in Amsterdam or New York or wherever, and you bid for a job on Upwork, you earn less than you could earn in the local labour market, if you're lucky enough to get work in the local labour market. But if you're even in Bulgaria, there was a very interesting study done in Bulgaria, even in Bulgaria, which is in the EU, the income that you get from Upwork is higher than the income you would get in the local labour market. And this is one of the things that explains that higher prevalence of platform work in Central and Eastern Europe and in Southern Europe compared with the North and the West of Europe. It's simply to do with wage levels.
Thank you so much for the. I really really enjoyed the presentation, and it was very insightful. And I have a comment and a question related with this, which is what the cycle that you showed about the household time crunch.
Oh.
That I'm sure you have thought about it, but it didn't show because when you show a cycle, it looks like it's a stable cycle. And obviously it cannot be. And to me it was very clear missing how that cycle is still maintained in Western countries, particularly in countries that don't have a strong public sector, which is like the externalization to migrant workers, their home countries, and to families, which, for example, in Spain has been huge during the pandemic. And to me, it was very interesting to see, because living in Berlin at the time, to see how it's coped differently in Germany than in Spain, where in Germany there were like schools and providing alternative services. In Spain is grandparents taking care when the kids were. So yeah, that was kind of missing. And my question related with that and how to break that cycle is that how should we, governments, policy, etc., act on that? And there is one part which is economic transfers to cover, and it was, I guess, there's not anymore, but it used to be a part of feminism of like we need a salary to cover for the care services, etc. But whether these kind of solutions actually perpetuate even more this cycle of commodification. I mean, this is what I would like to see, as I know your opinion on this, and whether they are appropriate or not, should be in parallel, etc. How we break up that circle, that cycle.
You're absolutely right. It's a schematic cycle that makes it look like a closed system, and of course it's not. It's like, I don't know if you're familiar with it. You know those fireworks that go round and round? We call them a Catherine wheel in English. Yeah, it's more like one of those, really. It's whizzing around and producing new polarizations and people flying out and implosions in the middle. It's much more like that, really. What are the solutions? One of the solutions, which is very often proposed, is that of a universal basic income.
Yeah.
And I argue in my most recent book, the one I showed you the cover of, it's not a magic bullet. It's absolutely not a magic bullet. An idea's been around ever since, you can see it as a modification of the 1970s demand that came mainly from Italian feminists, but also from some others for wages for housework, you know. It can work, but there are, it seems to me, about 4 problems with the way it's normally proposed by people like Guy Standing and so on. Propose it in a sort of completely abstract way, which could actually exacerbate the problems it's supposed to solve. Number 1, it has to be combined with a high minimum wage, a legal minimum wage. Because if you don't do that, it just becomes a subsidy to the employer to pay very low wages. We already have that in the UK. We have a system called universal credit. And what universal credit, it allows employers to pay wages which are below subsistence on the grounds that they will be picked up by the taxpayer. The taxpayer, this abstract concept, if you unpick it, you see that proportionately poor people contribute much more tax income to the government than rich people do, mainly through value-added taxes, which taxes on consumption, which it's a very regressive tax. Proportionately, poor people pay much more than rich people do. Income taxes have been going down and down and down. Corporation tax has been going down and down, and in most, but not all, European countries. So, in other words, the rich and the employers are contributing less and less to the tax system, and the poor people are contributing more and more. So that raises the next problem, which you have to avoid a universal basic income system, which is not just redistributing among the poor. You also have to make sure that it's not undermining public services. The way that the universal basic income is proposed in places like Silicon Valley, where they love it. Guy Standing makes so much money for doing lectures in Silicon Valley, I can't tell you. Because what it effectively does, it creates, you give people money which they then spend in the market. It's like a kind of a voucher system, and you can take away the, it not only creates a kind of reserve army of labour which is supported by the state that the employers can draw on when they feel like it and let go when they feel like it, but it also undermines the public services. So people go and buy health in the market, they go and buy education in the market, they don't have it as a right. which means that it's not delivered by properly employed workers, properly trained. It means it's delivered by casualised, poor-paid workers. So you have to make sure that the UBI is not linked to a destruction of public services. And finally, you have to make sure it's not linked to a destruction of, not finally, I've got one more point to it, a destruction of collective bargaining. Because in many countries, especially Germany, but not only Germany, there are a lot of benefits like pensions and so on are negotiated between unions and employers, and they accrue to the whole family of the worker, not just to the worker. And if you say, oh, well, we don't really need collective bargaining because the minimum wage is going to be provided by the state, then you undermine that collective bargaining process, and you destroy a lot of social reproduction services. Finally, and for me this is the most important issue, you have to make sure, when you talk about universal basic income, you have to say, not only ask the question who pays for it, who receives, but you also have to look at the question of eligibility. And if you have a lot of undocumented migrant workers, for instance, and you say it's only available to citizens, then the undocumented migrant workers don't get it, and they become a hyper-exploited underclass who are excluded from it. So you need a link to good immigration policies and citizenship policies, and one solution that is proposed to that is to link it to residence, not to citizenship, which can be done. It could be done. It's just if you reside in a certain area, then you automatically get it. But there are all these problems, basically, with UBI. Although, as a principle, I think it's wonderful. But the devil is in the detail in terms of how it's implemented. It could be really, really contribute to increasing the polarization of wealth that is currently the problem that we're living with. Right. Sorry, that was a bit long.
Juan?
Thanks, Ursula, for a great presentation. It was a privilege to attend this lecture. So, 2 points that I would like to bring up to you. And the first one, sorry if I missed it in the explanation, but I was also caught up by the statistics that you were showing in the study, the platform workers versus the non-platform workers. I wanted to see if you can expand or specify, what's defined by a platform worker. Because when you were presenting the numbers, I was reflecting back upon, the presentation from this morning and, the assemblage theory and the actor network theory. It's like what can be classified as a net platform worker, right? Is the person directly using, like if I'm in my apartment and I use the Airbnb application, right, to rent out my place. Am I the platform user? But if I'm also, hiring a person to clean up the apartment, but the person is never, associated with the use of the platform, will that qualify as a platform worker? So that is.
Well, the way the questionnaire was constructed was it was part of an omnibus survey, which is actually quite a good way to collect information about the so-called grey economy, because if people think it's an official government survey, they often will deny that they're doing things that they are actually doing. But an omnibus survey is you have companies that do every week, every 2 weeks, they do surveys all the time in countries, and they ask people which brand of sugar did you buy last week, and So if you ask questions mixed in with these kind of general questions, people are actually more likely to reply honestly, and because they ask a lot of political questions. Usually it's the normal way to ask questions about how do you intend to vote in the next election, because they need to get the results right. The omnibus companies are very careful about how they weight the data and how they structure the sample to represent different social classes, different age groups and so on. They don't want the embarrassment of predicting the election results wrong. So it's actually quite a good, it's in some ways crude, but it's quite a good and quite a quick way to do a general population survey. So we had a series of questions, have you done any of the following things? And then it was in the last week, in the last month, in the last 6 months, in the last year ever, or something like that in the categories. And and some of these questions were asked in order to exclude from the other answers. Have you asked your internet to do your non-grocery shopping, for instance, or have you used it to sell a product that you have made on a platform such as, in each case we gave 3 or 4 examples of platforms. We didn't say you're a platform worker because people won't know what a platform is, but on a platform such as Etsy or whatever. We did different ones in different countries. We looked at which was the most popular. Have you used an app or a website to find a permanent job? So that we wanted to exclude those people. Have you used an app or a website to rent out your property or a room in your property via a platform such as, Airbnb? Have you used an app or a website to find paid work? And that was a filter question. So if people said yes to that, then they were asked additional questions in the last week, in the last month, in the last whatever. So we were then able to, when we got the result, to separate out the people who said it was the last week. We categorised them as the frequent weekly workers. And then we found the people who said they had used an app to find work. We then asked what kind of work, and we had various categories. To use your own vehicle, to drive somebody to a destination, to use your own vehicle to deliver food, to use your own vehicle to deliver something else, to provide a service in somebody's home, such as childcare. And in each case we gave examples of names of platforms, and then we asked a subsequent question: how much of your income? What proportion of your income comes from this kind of work? 10%, 20%, And then we also had some questions about are you dependent on the, I can't remember the exact wording, do you use the app, does the app or the website tell you when a task is available? So that's where we got that thing that I presented in the first diagram. Does the app or the website require you to record the time that you work? A few more questions like that. So that's on the supply side. So then we were able to narrow down according to different definitions. The most tight definition is somebody who gets more than 10% of their income from the platform, or in some cases we can look at people who get more than 50% of their income from the platform, who does it at least weekly, and who also has the app giving them tasks and recording their time. So that gives us a very tight definition. We could use different definitions for different purposes. But as I say, the data is all there. You can look at it if you like. But then on the demand side, we said, have you, in the last week, in the last month, in the last year, whatever, used an app or a website to find accommodation, to the reverse, in other words, the supply, to order a taxi service, to order food to be delivered to your home, to find a cleaner, to find a care worker, etc., etc. So we pick up demand side and the supply side. So there is no question that says, are you a platform worker? Basically, you put together the definition by combining these different variables, and you can choose your definition up to a certain point. You could say, let's look at the people who use Airbnb and use Uber type platform. Do you see what I mean? It's as I said, it's there for you to play with, basically. And we also asked a few more, in the early surveys, we asked a few more questions to test their brand recognition. We asked them, have you heard of any of these platforms, and which other platforms have you heard of? Just to get a sense of how they were understanding the question, But you can never be sure in a survey. You can never be sure how people understand it. You get these weird anomalies.
Well, thank you for that explanation.
In fact, we also had a question saying, would you be available for a telephone interview to tell us more about what you do? And we did a few of those, and it was when we did those that we discovered how fuzzy a lot of the definitions were. because there are things like bulletin boards, for instance, that IT workers use to find work, which are not really a platform, but people are nevertheless using, you know, so that we find a lot of the definitions are quite fuzzy, actually, as is the case in any survey. But the follow-up interviews were interesting because they gave us some kind of qualitative knowledge.
Okay, it's now 10:04. And
Oh.
some of you getting a bit hungry by the middle of it. So I think if this would probably be the last comment, and it should be a quick one.
Okay. Yeah, sure. Just question regarding the platform itself. So basically, with this new economy, it talks about how, you know, democratization of the economy, because now people don't work, you know, like anybody can work for a platform. So I want to hear your thoughts, because in a way, for me, is we come from this market economy where, you know, you have these companies competing, right, for customers. And now you say now it's the people that are providing the services, right? But they're under this umbrella of one name, right? Airbnb or Uber or something like that. So I kind of see it as more of a monopoly, right? That you have no choice but to use one of those applications. And I see very little competition, you know, once you establish as a platform. So, and I read in business studies how a lot of these platforms work based on, you know, trust, you know, relational trust. I was very interested to hear you about, you know, the increase and the proliferation of locally based platforms. But I wanted to hear your thoughts about, you know, this issue with trust, because I see the platforms as a sort of a monopoly instead of a democratization of labor. And if you've explored the concept of trust and trust building, you know, within these platform economies versus the prior, you know, open market corporate economy.
Well, I mean, this is where you have to look at regulators. Regulators don't stand still. Huh? You think of the Wild West, you know, in America, and anybody can do anything, and that's what the world was like when the platform companies start. But you know, people don't stand still. They decide, oh well, you better ride on one side of the road and not the other, you know, and you know they rules start to be introduced. You know, that's the way civil society works. And for instance, in London, there is a regulation that says you can't rent out your property to Airbnb for more than 90 days a year. So what's happened? That's created secondary platforms that people turn to when they've used up their 90 days. You know, this sort of thing is quite normal. In some cities, the platforms have pulled out because they've been too much regulated in their view. You know, I think in Vienna, Uber pulled out, for example. But I think you have to think of this more broadly as a new rentier model of capitalism, and which is not so new. If you think of global chains like Starbucks and McDonald's, they work on a rentier model. They give franchises to, they don't pay for the building. They give a franchise to a local person to open a McDonald's, and then they take a percentage of the money. They make them use the brand. They make them buy their raw materials, but it's not part of the chain. That's why it was so easy for them to pull out of Russia, incidentally. But that doesn't stand still, because sooner or later it's already starting at the European Union level. As the other companies become more and more like platforms, introducing digital management because of the competition and because they can, the technologies are there, so why not use them? But so simultaneously, the platforms are being forced to behave more and more like regular employers by the regulatory authorities. And so you could say a new model of work is emerging, which is digitally managed work with maybe some kind of ambiguity around the extent to which the workers are employees, but the regulatory authorities are pushing towards making them more like employees, and the employers are pushing to make the employees a bit less secure, right? And this, to me, is quite optimistic, because it's creating a basis for new kinds of solidarities between regular employees and the reserve army, if you like, which might overcome some of those differences I was talking about earlier. The breakdown of the mid-20th century solidarities are arguably being, you see that in the UK right now, there's huge public support for the strikes that are happening in a way that you couldn't imagine for the last 40 years. Anyway, everybody needs their lunch, so I'm going to stop there. Right.
Thank you very, very much again.